Hello. Thank you everybody for coming. My name's Dave Goulson. I'm Professor of Biology at the University of Sussex. And I'm going to be talking to you today about insects, which are my kind of favourite subject. I've been interested in insects all my life. I don't know why, but when I was a little kid, one of my earliest memories is of collecting caterpillars. I was at lunchtime in primary school, and I found these little yellow and black stripy caterpillars and stuck them in my lunchbox and took them home. And I think I killed them all, but I got some more, and eventually they survived, and they turned into these beautiful red and black moths, which I'm sure some of you will recognize as the cinnabar moths. Anyway, I just thought that was magic, and I've been hooked ever since. But I don't think I was actually that weird. I think most children, given half a chance, are fascinated by bugs, by nature generally, and they love to hold things in their hand or whatever, get close up and personal with them. This is not me, obviously. It's my youngest son, Seth, taken a couple of years ago, and there he is with his pet cockchafer, Colin. Sadly, Colin's no longer with us. But Seth is still in his bug phase. He's got a moth trap he runs, and I really hope he never grows out of it. But sadly, most people, if they ever have a bug phase, they do grow out of it. And by the time they're teenagers or adults, they don't really like insects. Their reaction to an insect that comes near them is to flap around in fright and to try and kill it, which just seems really sad. And this kind of negative attitude to insects, I think, is rather nicely encapsulated by this sign that was put up on the University of South Wales campus last year. Top half is in Welsh, which if you're confused, but the bottom is obviously the English translation. Warning, flying insects in the area. I mean, you know, run for your lives. There might be a butterfly or a bee or a wasp or, you know, it's just absolutely nuts. And all it was some flying ants. You know, when an ant nest swarms and produces queens and males and they fly off, completely harmless creatures. So why the need for a huge red and white sign? I do not know. Anyway, I think insects are rather cool. They've been around a really long time. I'm just going to give you a little introduction to the world of insects. They evolved about 480 million years ago, which is way back in time, twice as long ago as the first dinosaurs. And because they've been around so long, they've had time to speciate into this incredible variety of weird and wonderful forms. We've named 1.1 million species of insect, which means they make up about 70% of all known life on our planet. And what's really fascinating is it's estimated that there are maybe another 4 or 5 million more insects that we haven't yet discovered on our own planet. Isn't that amazing? So who knows what creatures are out there waiting to be discovered. Anyway, I thought I'd start off by just showing you some pictures of some nice insects. So it's nothing too taxing. The talk gets a bit depressing in the middle, so this is just to start at least with a positive aspect. So this is a fairly random example, but one of my favourite insects. This is an acorn weevil. It's a British species. I put it up because weevils are the most successful group of organisms on the planet, measured as numbers of species. There are 90,000 different species of weevil, just a subset of beetles, all of them with this funny down-curved little snout. There are beautifully camouflaged insects. There are some that pretend to be flowers to lure insects to their doom. This is an orchid mantis. There are insects that pretend to be other insects. This is a fly pretending to be a bumblebee. This is a species, it's on the wing now in Britain, the bumblebee hoverfly. Very handsome little chap. There are lots of brightly coloured insects out there advertising that they're poisonous, things including, of course, the one on the right there is the cinnabar moth caterpillar that I collected as a kid. There are some insects that are just really weird and we have no idea why they look like they do. This one exudes little coloured wax strands from its bottom for no known purpose. It looks a bit like an optic fibre. Must do something, but we don't know what. And there's even, look at this, there is a bug that lives in Thailand that looks just like Elvis. Well, kind of, with a bit of imagination. Anyway, on to more serious stuff. Sadly, as I'm sure people are aware, there's pretty clear evidence that insects are in decline. their abundance has dropped markedly over time. There's a big recent kind of a meta-analysis, it's called, a kind of pooling of all the existing data, which estimated that insects globally are declining by somewhere between 1% and 2% a year on average, which doesn't perhaps sound very fast, but these declines probably started at least 80 years ago, so that starts to really add up. The only aspect of insect declines that many people have noticed, of course, is this one. I'm sure you can tell what you're looking at on the picture. The bug splat windscreen phenomenon, or lack of it in recent decades. I'm not exactly sure when it stopped, and of course it wasn't a sudden thing, it would have been gradual over time, but many of us can remember a time where if you drove for any length of time at this time of year, you would have to stop every few hours to scrub the windscreen because it would be covered in bug guts. And it just doesn't happen anymore. And that isn't because cars, or certainly not entirely because cars are more streamlined, because the Kent Wildlife Trust recently did a study where they recruited people driving classic cars to count the bug splats, and they also found no bug splats despite their unaerodynamic cars. Anyway, we do have more scientific evidence than bug splats for insect declines. One of the best known studies came from Germany, published in 2017, which was based on malaise trapping of flying insects. That thing top right is it looks like a little tent. It's a malaise trap, catches all kinds of flying insects. And the chart there shows you the daily weight, the biomass of insects caught per trap per day, which, as you can see, fell. So the data start in 1989 and continue to 2016. And so that's a 27-year period during which the average catch fell by 76%. So seemingly 3/4 of the insects disappeared from Germany in a quarter of a century. That's pretty terrifying. Closer to home, one more example before we move on from depressing decline data. I study bumblebees. I spent the last 30 years studying bumblebees. Beautiful creatures. I could talk about them for hours. This is one species of British bumblebee, the shrill carder bumblebee, which has a particularly high-pitched buzz, hence the name. And as you can see from the dots on the map, it used to be a common insect, at least in the bottom half of Britain. It was regularly turned up in gardens and all manner of places 60 or 70 years ago. But as time's gone on, it's disappeared. By the time I became interested in understanding why bumblebees were declining in about 2000, and I wanted to find out more about the shrill carder, which I'd read about in books, but I couldn't find anywhere. So I went to Salisbury Plain there to look for it, and spent a whole summer hunting around for shrill carder bumblebees. Did eventually find some and got really excited. I only found 3 or 4 in a whole summer of looking. But anyway, that population has now gone extinct since I saw them there 20 odd years ago. And the one on the Somerset Levels to the west seems to be about to go extinct. It's down to a tiny number of bees. So this is an example of a species which in my lifetime has gone from being a widespread, pretty common insect to one that could go extinct within a handful of years. And it's declining right now, and this has all happened on our watch. This is not something that happened in the past. It's ongoing. And of course, these insect declines, whether you like insects or not, they matter because insects are really important for what they do in ecosystems. I've already mentioned that they make up 70% of all known biodiversity in terms of numbers of species. But then they're food for most of the things that aren't insects. So these beautiful bee-eater birds and many other species of bird rely on insects as their main source of protein, as do bats and lots of freshwater fish like trout and salmon and frogs and toads and lizards and so on. They're all dependent on insects as food. So if the insects go, then that means the food goes for all these other creatures. Insects aren't just important as food, though. They perform all sorts of other functions, things like controlling pests. A really vital contribution of insects to farming is they help to control pest numbers in crops if you don't kill them with pesticides. They're recyclers. They recycle cowpats, and generally dung and dead leaves and dead bodies, corpses get gobbled up by carrion beetles and blowfly larvae and so on. It's not glamorous stuff, but it's really important. It releases the nutrients in those in the cowpats or whatever, and that then enables the nutrient cycle to continue and more plants to grow to be eaten by more cows and so on. They help to keep the soil healthy, they distribute seeds, they do all sorts of stuff. And nearly all of this we just take for granted, or actually I think most people don't think about at all. The only thing that people know that insects do for us is this one, pollination. This is really widely recognized. I think most people understand that bees at least are important as pollinators. And they are, but I should stress that it isn't just bees. Pollination is done by thousands of species of insect, including butterflies and moths, lots of different species of flies and wasps and beetles and so on. So one estimate suggests that just in the UK there are maybe 6,000 pollinating insect species, so it definitely isn't just the bees. But between them, insects pollinate 80% of all the plants on the planet in terms of numbers of species, which is obviously vital. If that were to stop, it would just be catastrophic for all terrestrial ecosystems. And of course, they're important directly to us for pollinating our crops. We've become used to our supermarkets being full of this beautiful array of produce. 75% of the crops we grow in the world wouldn't give a good harvest without insect pollinators, and that includes most of the fruits and vegetables essentially. So things like apples, strawberries, blueberries, tomatoes, pumpkins and squashes, even things like coffee and chocolate in the tropics depend upon insect pollinators to give a good harvest. So without insects, the supermarket wouldn't look so good. And the harsh truth is it would be really hard to feed the human population. People would starve if we lost our pollinators. So we need to make sure we don't end up like this. You may have seen these pictures before. These are taken in southwest China, where there is a huge area of apple and pear orchards, which are now hand pollinated by the farmers, and they send their children climbing up to the higher branches because there are very few pollinators left due to very high pesticide use in these orchards. Now that's just about economically viable in China, where labor costs are cheap and this is a pretty high value crop. But it's hard to imagine farmers in Europe hand pollinating their fields of oilseed rape. And in fact, this isn't just a theoretical concern in Europe. There's already evidence from the UK that Gala apple farmers in the UK are currently losing about £6 million a year's worth of yield due to inadequate pollination of their crops. So we're already on the way towards this kind of rather more doomsday scenario. One potential solution to the bee or pollinator crisis is this one. There are a number of labs around the world, including at least one in the UK, that are trying to build robot bees to replace the real bees. I hope you agree with me that that's a completely bonkers idea, but it's being taken relatively seriously. Just imagine, I mean, think of, you know, the resources. We would need to build trillions of these things if we were going to pollinate the world's crops, and no one's going to build robots to pollinate wildflowers. Why would they do that? So it would use huge amounts of plastics and metals and energy to do. They're going to end up breaking down and littering the countryside. And, you know, imagine worst case scenario, Vladimir Putin's computer hackers break into the bee-bot control system and turn them against us. It just seems like a really dumb idea when we have real bees that have been pollinating flowers for 120 million years, and they're really quite good at it. They're biodegradable, they're carbon neutral, they're self-replicating. They seem to have a lot of desirable properties in a pollinator. And do we really think we can do better? It just seems sad that we're even trying to go down that route. I don't really want to live in a world where we have robot bees. So you can make a pretty good argument for that we need insects, that it's in our selfish personal interests to look after them. But this argument, and I've trotted this argument out hundreds of times, and it's completely valid, but I do find it slightly less than satisfying because it doesn't really capture why I think we should look after insects. And it leaves a lot of insects high and dry because they perhaps don't do anything useful. So I'm concerned about insect declines, not so much because I'm worried about the apple supply in the supermarket, but more because I just think they're rather lovely and amazing and wonderful and beautiful, and the world would be a poorer place without them. And there are quite a lot of insects that probably don't do anything useful to us. And if we base all of our arguments for protecting insects and more broadly biodiversity on what it does for us, then does that mean we just abandon the ones that don't do anything for us to die? So this creature on screen is the St. Helena giant earwig, the biggest earwig that ever lived, an absolute whopper. It's about 3 inches long. I wish I'd seen one, but I never did, and I never will because it's extinct. It only ever lived on St. Helena, which is a tiny island in the South Atlantic, and it sadly died out, we think probably because it was eaten by the rats that we accidentally took to the island. But it disappeared. There were no repercussions. It wasn't delivering some vital ecosystem service that the world couldn't do without. But it does seem to me that the world is a sadder place for not having a giant earwig, even though none of us were ever going to go there and see it, and likewise all the other insects that are out there. So what can we do to prevent these declines from continuing and to ensure populations of insects for future human generations to enjoy? For the rest of my talk, I'm going to briefly run through 3 different areas which all offer things that we can do that will hopefully make a difference. And I'm going to start with farming, because obviously this is a farming conference. But it is, forgive me that my treatment of these 3 subjects is pretty shallow, because I haven't got terribly long to cover them. And I'm not a farmer, I hasten to add. I'm a scientist, and I'm slightly loath to tell farmers how to farm when I'm not a farmer myself. But I want to make some observations about farming which might be useful. And then I'll talk a little bit about rewilding, which is a bit of a controversial subject, to some at least. And I'll finish off by talking about what we can do in our gardens, because although this is a farming meeting, most people also have a garden, and many more people, of course, have gardens than have farms. Okay, so we've gone down a route of industrialized farming, where fields have got bigger, farms have got bigger, inputs have increased steadily over time, both fertilizers and pesticides. There's been a real focus on maximizing yields and growing ever larger fields containing a single crop, a monoculture. And there's been a great decline in the diversity of different crops grown over time, so that we've ended up with a very homogeneous landscape, very lacking in life. And not wanting to farmer bash in the slightest, but we have to recognize that modern farming often creates an environment that is fairly hostile to biodiversity. Now, most people, obviously this is an unusual audience, you're mostly involved in farming, but most people who aren't everyday folk who aren't farmers, I don't think they really think about it at all. But if they do think about the way we farm, they probably just assume that it's necessary to have this kind of farming to feed the world, because the human population is growing. There are already 8 billion of us. There's going to be 10, perhaps 12 billion of us quite soon. I think people probably just assume that we have to have this kind of huge-scale monoculture farming to feed everybody. But I have concerns, and I think everybody here probably has concerns, that this isn't really a sustainable approach for a number of reasons, which are fairly obvious if you're involved in farming. Firstly, as I've already explained, farming is impacting biodiversity, but it depends upon biodiversity. It needs organisms to keep the soil healthy and recycle nutrients and control pests and pollinate the crops and so on. So it's undermining its own foundations by driving declines of all of these creatures. And in a very similar way, the United Nations recently estimated that about 40% of the world's soils are already badly degraded, and much of that the result of intensive farming practices. we all know that soil takes an awful long time to replace once it's lost. So what are we expecting our children and grandchildren to grow their food in if we don't look after soil? And then, of course, the third one, as the polar bear is there to remind me that, of course, food production globally is a big contributor to climate change. Something like 25 to 30% of greenhouse gases are associated with farming and food processing and so on. So I think there's a real danger that if we carry on down this route of ever more industrialized agriculture, people in the future will end up starving precisely because we've done too much of this and it's damaged the environment. I want to say a little bit specifically about pesticides, which is a field that I reluctantly got drawn into about 15 years ago, having previously not worked on them. Rachel Carson wrote the book Silent Spring, and it was published in 1962, 61 years ago. She was the first person to draw attention to the fact that using pesticides was harmful to wildlife and people. You'd think that was quite obvious, really, but it hadn't occurred to anyone for the first 20-odd years of pesticide use. They mostly started being used after the Second World War. When she published Silent Spring, it was hugely controversial. There was a big backlash. She was severely criticized and accused of all sorts of things. But in the end, people came around to accepting that actually she was correct. And she sort of won the day in that the pesticides she was most concerned about at the time were the organochlorides, things like DDT, which eventually came to be banned, although sadly she didn't live long enough to see that. She died only a couple of years after publishing Silent Spring. So seemingly she won the day, but actually I think if she were alive today and knew what was happening, she'd be horrified to see how things have changed since she published Silent Spring. She was American, and in 1962 there were about 37 different pesticides available to farmers to use. Today in the United States there are about 1,000 different pesticides available to farmers to use, and some of them are thousands of times more poisonous to wildlife than, for example, DDT was. So the situation doesn't really seem to have improved. Also, the weight of pesticides applied globally has gone up steadily for the last 80 years, and it's just recently passed 4 million tons of pesticides per year being applied to the global environment. These are all compounds intended to kill. Elsewhere in the world, the situation is probably a lot worse than it is in Britain. We should recognize actually that Britain and Europe has fairly good regulation of pesticides compared to everywhere else. In the United States, they have many more pesticides than we do. They allow use of ones that have been banned here, and they'll often apply them rather indiscriminately from crop dusters. This also happens in South America and places like Brazil. Pretty terrifying. Imagine the amount of drift. You can see the pesticide drifting in the wind. In developing countries, pesticide use is more or less completely unregulated. I took this picture in Calcutta a couple of years ago. This is a local small-scale farmer on the edge of the city, grows fruits and vegetables. He's using an ancient old brass pump sprayer to spray paraquat herbicide, which is banned in Europe as being far too dangerous for you only have to consume about a drop of it for it to kill you. This guy is using no protective equipment. He hasn't got gloves. He's not even wearing shoes, and he probably has no idea how dangerous the compound he's using is. The reason I'm showing you this is because, in a sense, we are responsible for what's happening here. Paraquat is manufactured in Huddersfield, so we banned it in Europe. It's too dangerous for us to use, but we're happy to make it and sell it to people like this poor guy, which just seems staggeringly hypocritical. So things are pretty bad elsewhere in the world, but they're not all that rosy in the UK. So if we return closer to home, this chart shows you this is DEFRA data on the area of pesticide, the area of crop treated with pesticides each year in the UK. And the way the way they calculate this is if a hectare of crop is sprayed with 2 pesticides, that counts as 2 hectares sprayed. So there are about 4 million hectares of the UK, and so you can see if you look at the the scale on the left, on average, each area of arable land in the UK was, at the beginning of this time period, 1990, treated about 10 times. That could be a farmer spraying 10 pesticides at once, or spraying 10 different pesticides at different times, or spraying the same pesticide 10 different times, or some combination of those things. Anyway, pesticide use has increased by about 70% in terms of number of sprays per hectare of crop in the UK since then. So we're using more and more. This shows you a similar thing specifically for oilseed rape in the UK. So the chart shows you the number of spray applications of 4 different types of pesticide, the different coloured bars. The insecticides are the green ones. But you can see from 1988 to 2018, there was a considerable increase. Roughly the number of spray applications going on to oilseed rape tripled during that time period. So we went from, on average, slightly less than 1 insecticidal application in 1990 to about 2.5 on average per field most recently. And the odd thing is, there's been no corresponding increase in yield. So farmers are applying more pesticide for no quantifiable benefit. So that just shows you yields of the main arable crops grown in the UK. The oilseed bar at the bottom, you can see hasn't really gone up at all. It's flatlining. So farmers are applying 3 times as many pesticides for the same return. That should be sending warning bells, I would have thought, that something is wrong. We can't carry on applying more and more pesticide to get the same result. And just to illustrate, going back to the sort of global picture, the consequences, the exposure of insects to pesticides globally. This is from a Swiss study which analysed samples of honey collected from around the world. And the Swiss scientists were particularly interested in neonicotinoid insecticides, which have become very controversial. They're banned in Europe now because they're incredibly poisonous to insect life, particularly honeybees. So they got honey samples from all over the world and they screened them for neonicotinoid insecticides. All the white dots are honey samples that didn't have any pesticide in them. 75% of honey samples from all around the world were contaminated with neurotoxic insecticides, these neonicotinoids, which are essentially neurotoxins. It's kind of like Novichok for insects. If 3/4 of the world's honeybees are being poisoned, they're exposed to this contamination through collecting nectar from contaminated flowers. That means that all the other thousands and thousands of insects that visit flowers for nectar are also being poisoned all around the world. You know, perhaps we shouldn't be terribly surprised that insects are declining. Okay, so what might a more sustainable system of farming look like? Well, and the good news is there's some really exciting things happening here. It's quite heartening. You know, it's easy to get depressed, and a lot of the stuff I've just told you is all quite depressing. You know, we do have a biodiversity crisis, we have a climate crisis, but at the same time, there's a huge recognition that we need to fix these problems, and all the people here today and at the Oxford Real Farming Conference that I went to back in January are all trying to find a way forward, a way to farm more sustainably. I think it's kind of useful to step back and say, you know, what would the perfect farming system deliver? And I've come up with a quick sort of hit list of things that I think we need to think about. So obviously we need to produce enough food to feed everyone, ideally to feed everyone a healthy diet, which we are failing to do at the moment because we don't grow a big enough diversity of crops in the world. Roughly 50% of all the food we grow is from just 4 different crops: wheat, rice, maize, and soybean. We don't grow enough fruits and vegetables either in the UK or in the world for everyone to have a recommended amount of fruits and vegetables in their diet. So we need to grow, I think, a greater diversity of crops and more fruits and vegetables, which would also help to support more biodiversity because you'd be putting more variety, more diversity into the landscape if it wasn't just all fields of wheat and oilseed rape. So we need a greater crop diversity. I think it sounds a bit unscientific, but essentially we need to work with nature. We need to stop trying to kill everything and use chemical means of control, and instead encourage natural enemies of crop pests, and support pollinator populations into the future by minimizing their exposure to pesticides. So I think one way or another we need to either greatly reduce pesticide use or move towards pesticide-free versions of farming. We also, of course, as part of all this, we need to look after the soil. I think there's quite a lot of evidence that small farms are more likely to deliver these benefits than large ones. It's a shame that we've moved towards ever bigger farms, because there's pretty good evidence that small farms produce more food per hectare than big farms. They're more efficient, and they tend to be better for biodiversity. So if we could find a way of supporting smaller farmers to make them more viable than they are at present, that would probably help. So, as I say, there are some really exciting things going on. There's reason to be optimistic that I think we can transform the way we produce food. These are just a few examples that I think are kind of interesting. The success of the Nature-Friendly Farming Network, which now has thousands of farming members, all people who want to work out how to support more wildlife on their land while still maintaining a viable business and feeding the world. It's really heartening. I saw the agroforestry tent somewhere over that way. Agroforestry seems to be a really interesting idea for breaking up big fields with strips of trees, which will help to hold the soil together and support much more biodiversity and provide a different income stream for farmers. It could be timber, it could be fruits or nuts, or providing more fodder for livestock. There's some really exciting research going on in that area. And obviously there's also the pesticide-free options like organic farming and biodynamic farming. Now, biodynamic farming, again, it may not seem all that scientific. Some of the practices of biodynamic farming seem to be slightly kind of left field, using kind of infinite dilutions of mixtures of minerals and so on. But I've been to quite a few biodynamic farms, and they really seem to work. If you walk around, the soil is black and full of organic matter, and there are bees and butterflies and birds in abundance. And if you look at the yield of their crops, it's actually really high compared to conventional farming. So it shows that we can have biodiversity and food production in the same place successfully. They don't have to be mutually exclusive as they've often become. Okay, I'm going to leave farming there, having probably annoyed half the people here. And talk about rewilding, which might upset some more people. So I know rewilding has become a controversial topic. I'm not sure that George Monbiot has done it any favours by championing it, because he tends to put people's hackles up. But I think it has its place, and I want to just explain why I think that. So I came across rewilding in the context of, first, in the context of Yellowstone National Park. And forgive me if you've heard this story before, but I think it bears retelling. So Yellowstone is a huge national park in the United States, which until recently was completely overrun with elk, what they call elk, which are basically red deer. The population was vast because there were no predators, which meant there was terrible overgrazing, the trees weren't able to regenerate, there was soil erosion, and very little biodiversity. And so the decision was taken to replace the missing predator from the landscape, the wolf, which had been there naturally but had been hunted out many years earlier. It was highly controversial, but they went ahead and they released a few wolves. Not enough to make a big dent in the elk population, but apparently enough to change the behavior of the elk. They tended to start staying out in the open and avoiding places where they could easily be caught by wolves. Particularly, they started avoiding steep-sided river valleys where they could easily be trapped, which meant that trees started to regenerate along the sides of the rivers, which meant that there was more food for beavers, and the beaver population grew, which created more wetlands, which supported much more bird life. And so there was this whole cascade of positive benefits from introducing a few dozen wolves to this huge landscape, which I guess suggests that restoring missing keystone species to ecosystems can have real benefits for biodiversity. In a UK context, things are a bit different. I personally would love to have wolves running around, but I know that's not going to happen anytime soon. Possibly it might in the far north of Scotland, but it certainly isn't going to happen in Hertfordshire, I don't think. But actually, the rewilding in the UK is mostly focused on a different aspect. It's focused on restoring missing herbivores, and there's a logic to this. So I remember being taught when I was at university that Europe was a dense forest before people arrived and started chopping the trees down, which it always slightly puzzled me because I couldn't understand, like, where did all the flowers and butterflies and things live that live in sunny open meadows if it was all dense forest? It didn't quite add up. More recently, most ecologists have come around to accepting that actually it wasn't dense forest. It was probably much more of a mosaic of open areas with bits of forest, more like perhaps a savanna or a wood meadow or, wood pasture, because of the action of big herbivores. Things like the auroch, the ancestor of the cow, which was an enormous beast that would have been able to knock over small saplings and so on. And all the other herbivores. You've only got to go back about 110,000 years, and there were elephants wandering around England. Nobody's suggesting we should release elephants, but it's an interesting thought. And it's even been argued, a completely untestable hypothesis, but I thought it was quite cool, that oak trees might be so stout as an evolutionary adaptation to being knocked, or to not being knocked over by elephants. We'll never know whether it's true, but it's kind of an interesting idea. You know, from an oak tree's point of view, it's only been a few generations since those elephants were here. Anyway, so the rewilding projects that are best known in the UK have involved restoring big herbivores as best we can. And I want to tell you a little bit. I don't know if Charlie Burrell is here. I know he's here in the broader sense of Charlie. Anyone here? No, he's here at Groundswell. He's the guy who, together with Izzy Tree, his wife, set up the NEP rewilding project, which is in West Sussex, which is a 3,500 acre estate, which they farmed conventionally until about 25 years ago. But it's on a heavy clay soil. It's not very fertile. It's not terribly productive. So they took all the subsidies they could get and they farmed the hell out of it for decades. And they were making a loss from their estate. So they decided to do something different. They decided to rewild it, which in essence involved putting a bigger fence around the outside, introducing some missing big herbivores, and then stepping back to just let nature take its course and see what happens. So they introduced these English longhorn cattle, which are a tough old breed that can survive without really any help from people. Sadly, they weren't allowed to release wild boar, even though it's a native species and there are quite a lot of them wandering around Britain already. So they had to release Tamworth pigs as the nearest substitute they could. Some Exmoor ponies to replace the ancient wild horses that used to live in southern Britain, and some red deer. And also, more recently, beavers, how exciting, and storks, which they've successfully reintroduced. So now we're 20 odd years on, and I would just recommend, if you get the opportunity, particularly in late spring or summer, to visit this place. You don't have to pay. You can go on public footpaths and walk right through the heart of it. And I just think it's really cool because it is teeming with life. Things like nightingales are really common there. They have the second biggest population of nightingales in the whole of Britain, from having had no nightingales at the start of the project 20 years ago. Cuckoos are a familiar sound there. Now, I virtually never hear cuckoos. I live in East Sussex. Used to hear them when I was a kid. They were a common sound, but they've become very scarce in lowland England in recent years. But there are loads of them at NEP. And on the insect front, they've got purple emperors in huge numbers, the biggest population of purple emperor butterflies in the whole of Britain, from a standing start of 0 purple emperors when they started the project. If you saw the Wild Isles Attenborough series, they filmed the purple emperors at NEP because they're so easy to see there. Even last year they had large tortoiseshells. That's top right, it's a large tortoiseshell, which is supposed to be extinct in Britain. There's some slight suspicions as to whether it was a natural event, that its sudden appearance. But anyway, it seems to be working in the sense that it's supporting biodiversity. It's also capturing carbon, and providing an amazing kind of recreational opportunity. Tens of thousands of people go there every year to walk around and re-engage with nature. And it seems to me that for the least productive areas of land in Britain, it should at least be an option to farmers to go down this route, to, instead of trying to produce a small amount of food off infertile land, as Charlie was, to instead support biodiversity and support recreation and support carbon capture. Of course, we can't rewild everywhere, and we need to grow lots of food. We mustn't forget that. But I strongly believe there is a place for rewilding. Okay, and then just to finish off, I'm going to spend 5 minutes rather quickly talking about what we can do in our gardens, because whether or not you're a farmer, many of us have gardens. And although they're relatively small scale compared to farmland, 70% of Britain is farmland, they do still cover quite a bit of area. There are about 22 million private gardens in Britain, covering about 400,000 hectares of land, which is a bigger area than all of our nature reserves. So just imagine if most of them were wildlife friendly, full of wildflowers and pesticide free and so on. That would really help. And if we could get the local councils on board so that the road verges and the roundabouts were also nature friendly, then that would be a national network which would really make a difference for wildlife, I think. I've written books about it. Sorry to plug my books, but I put this in to remind me that I'm doing a book signing 200 yards that way immediately after this talk, should anyone wish to buy any of my books. Or if you're a cheapskate and won't buy my books, you can find most of the information on YouTube, actually, where I ramble on and videos. Anyway, so people think of gardening as a green activity. You know, what could be more green than growing flowers and fruits and vegetables in your garden? But actually, sadly, gardening is kind of at a fork in the road, I think. While some of us are championing wildlife gardening and no mow May and all that kind of stuff, there are a growing number of people whose garden looks like this. 8% of British gardens now have plastic lawns, believe it or not. Isn't that an utterly depressing statistic? You can even buy, you may not be able to tell, but that is a plastic box hedge. You can buy plastic wisteria to nail to your house, and they'll flower for 12 months of the year. What's not to love? Doesn't that illustrate a degree of disconnect from nature that is just terribly depressing? You can even get, look at this. This is to clean your plastic lawn and make it smell like a meadow. Anyway, so gardens can be full of life. They don't, if we go down the other route. And there's this lovely example from Leicester, where a lady called Jenny Owen, she spent 35 years cataloguing all the wildlife she could find in her little 1/8 of an acre garden. And her species list after 35 years of hunting around was 2,673 different species. Isn't that amazing? That level of biodiversity, and quite close to Leicester city centre. So gardens can be full of life. So what do we do to make them more full of life? Interesting weed seeds blowing through. I haven't got time to do anything more than a really shallow treatment of this. But I think most people are aware mowing less is a really simple thing. If you've got a lawn, just don't cut it every week. You don't need something that looks like a Wimbledon tennis court with stripes up and down. As soon as you stop mowing, flowers start to appear. And if you can bring yourself to do it, if you just mow once or twice a year, you'll soon end up with your own wildflower meadow. That's my lawn, by the way, and I didn't ever sow any wildflower seeds at all. Of course, it's also the councils also do an awful lot of mowing of road verges and roundabouts and so on, which seems to me to be very often unnecessary. Sometimes it's necessary for safety issues along roads, but much of it isn't. And most of our road verges could look like this if we wanted them to. So campaigning to persuade your local council not to cut the verges every 5 minutes is also a simple thing we could all do. Grow more native wildflowers in your garden. Don't plant exotics if you can plant a beautiful native wildflower instead. There's tons of evidence that natives are better for pollinators and also better for providing food plants for the caterpillars of butterflies and so on. And there's loads of really beautiful native plants that you can grow in your garden. Instead of being tolerant of native plants, unfortunately many councils do this kind of thing. It's common practice for the council to employ teams of people to drive around the urban areas of Britain looking for anything green, and if they see it, they jump out and kill it with some herbicide. Why do they do that? Why is that necessary? That picture shows you a little patch of green, probably grass, probably not terribly exciting from a wildlife perspective, but it was alive. Surely it's better than what's there now, that dead, dismal patch of grass. It just seems like completely needless environmental vandalism to do this. And surely we can become a bit more tolerant of wild plants growing in our streets. Aside from the ecological impact of this unnecessary herbicide use, there's also the issue that usually they're using Roundup, which is a glyphosate-based herbicide, and it's hugely controversial. There's evidence both ways, but there is quite a lot of evidence that that's a carcinogen, that particularly the people applying it are exposed to enough to increase their risk of getting non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. That's disputed by Monsanto, who make glyphosate, of course, but nonetheless, there is quite a strong body of evidence, which surely makes spraying it in our streets. I've even seen it being sprayed on children's play equipment in parks, just in the name of tidiness. That seems completely bonkers to me. Personally, I think we should just ban pesticide use in towns. We don't need them in our gardens. We don't need them in our streets. And if you think that's controversial, Paris, France have already done it. In 2018, they banned pesticides. Only licensed farmers can buy pesticides now. So Paris is pesticide free. If Paris can be pesticide free, and it hasn't been overrun by giant dandelions or cockroaches or whatever, then why can't London? Why can't every town and city? One more thing before I wrap up. Do beware. If you have a dog or a cat, and a great many of us do have a dog or a cat, that you may well have been advised by your vet to drip a flea treatment on its neck once a month, which vets will very commonly advise prophylactically. So even if your dog or cat doesn't have fleas, they'll recommend you use it anyway to prevent them from getting fleas. These are the two most popular brands. There are others available. The one on the left there, Advocate, its active ingredient is imidacloprid. You've probably never heard of imidacloprid, but it's a neonicotinoid insecticide again. It's banned in farming, has been banned since 2018 in the UK, but you can still drip it on your family pet. The dose you're supposed to drip on the neck of a medium-sized dog is enough to kill 60 million honeybees. That's a really potent insecticide to be using in your house. Fipronil, the one on the right, is similarly toxic. We recently discovered that 100% of British rivers are contaminated with fipronil, almost certainly coming from dogs and cats. 70% of them are also contaminated with imidacloprid. So we've got potent insecticides swirling around in all of our rivers from this one use of pesticides on dogs and cats. Anyway, let me wrap up. Rachel Carson said, if I remember correctly, that mankind's war against nature is inevitably a war against himself. I think, well, she was right, and I think we somehow need to reconnect. We need to stop trying to kill everything and control everything with chemicals, and instead remember that we are part of nature, not apart from it. And somehow we need to rekindle that love and respect for nature that I think we once had. It's easy to forget that it's preposterous. We are clinging to the surface of a rock hurtling through space. How strange is that? With a skin of life clinging to its surface. It's completely unique. It gives us everything. It is our home. It gives us food, water, clean air, and everything else, and a source of inspiration and beauty. And I don't understand why we've been so reckless with our amazing planet. And of course, it really worries me and anyone, I think, that has children. You know, we would do anything for our kids, wouldn't we, apart from apparently leave them a decent planet to live on. We have to do better, and I think we can. And a good place to start is by looking after the little things that live all around us, these insects. Thank you, everybody, for bearing with my ramble. I'm very happy to take questions. If anyone, there's a roving mic stick your hand up if you want to ask a question, and the mic is here. Lady at the front. Oh, sorry, been beaten to it.
Thank you, Dave. Are honeybees part of the solution to the insect decline or part of the problem? And are they competing our native pollinators?
Yeah, so there is clear evidence, sadly. I love honeybees and I eat honey, but if you have too many honeybees, they compete with wild pollinators. They take most of the resources, and that has an impact on populations of wild insects. So in their place, they're great. They're really good, effective pollinators of some crops. But particularly urban areas often have way more honeybees than they can support, and that really undermines the efforts of wildlife gardeners to try and support nature. So they're great, but not too many, basically. The guy at the front here. Oh, sorry, that lady was first. You'll be next.
Thanks. Can you comment at all on light pollution and any effect that might be having on insects?
Yeah, there's a whole chapter on it in my new book, Silent Earth. Sorry. Yes, so light pollution has a number of impacts on insects, including obviously attracting and disorientating moths and other nocturnal flying insects, which then fly around in circles until they're eaten by a bat or caught in a spider's web, which is all bad. But there are more subtle impacts as well. There was a recent study that showed that so some dung beetles, they navigate using the light of the Milky Way at night to orientate themselves. But if there's light pollution, they can't see the Milky Way, so they go all over the place and get lost, poor things. And there's also some evidence that lights in the winter can make the day length seem longer than it is. So that insects think spring has arrived and they emerge from hibernation in January and then die because it's winter. So there are all sorts of subtle impacts that we might not have expected. Guy here.
I was talking to a gentleman up the way about using nematodes to control certain insects and caterpillars on box hedging and such. What do you think about using a nematode for that type?
Yeah, there's been I'm slightly wary, but it must be a better option than using an insecticide. Probably more effective too. They are fairly specific. You know, I mean, an insecticide will kill all insects. Those nematodes have a much narrower host range in terms of they'll only kill, the ones used against box moth will only kill Lepidoptera. So they certainly seem to be a big step in the right direction. I'm slightly worried that there may turn out to be unanticipated consequences of this huge growth in use of nematodes, that something may crop up that we haven't thought of. But at the moment, I think the evidence is they are a better bet. Anyone else?
I was just wondering, in terms of if you're trying to rewild or help with the garden and things, if you back onto a field that uses pesticides on a regular basis, how can you support the insects in the garden when the crops are then sprayed with the pesticides and things? The best you can probably do is grow a really thick hedge to minimise any spray drift. I mean, if the farmer is responsible, then he should be taking care not to spray when there's any wind anyway, which hopefully would reduce the risk to your wildlife. But if you grow a tall, thick hedge, that will filter out almost everything, I should think. I mean, you can't stop your insects flying out, unfortunately, and then being zapped. But that's the best I can suggest, I'm afraid. Crikey, lots of hands up. Whoever's nearest.
Cheers, Dave. One of the questions I've got was around the value of planting wildflowers around road verges. So we know that it's become quite popular in some councils, particularly where I am in North Yorkshire. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts about the value of that, because we know that pollinators obviously can struggle to get over big barriers like roads anyway. Is it just kind of icing on the cake, or does it actually make a real difference?
Yeah, there's quite a lot of debate about the benefits of flowers on road verges. Obviously, there's some concern that you might be luring insects to live somewhere where that, you know, if they fly a couple of meters in the wrong direction, they're going to get splattered by a car, or you're luring insects to live in a place where They're going to be exposed to pollutants from cars, all the particulates and exhaust emissions and so on. But that said, there was a review of kind of the information we have published relatively recently that concluded that they almost certainly, for most insects, are a net benefit. There are costs, but they're more than offset by the flowers. So yeah, I think we should definitely be encouraging wildflowers on road verges.
Hello. Hi, Dave. Thanks for that. I just wanted to get your opinion on the pollen and nectar mixes that the Countryside Stewardship pay farmers to plant, because I've recently started looking into it, and it seems to me that a lot of these mixes are very few species diversity. Some of them are non-native, they're perennial, some of them. How much benefit are we actually getting from them?
There is a concern. I mean, so there is evidence that the pollen and nectar strips planted by farmers have probably helped to increase populations of some generalist common bee species, some of the common bumblebees. But I have concerns, and I know others do as well, that there's a danger that we're just kind of homogenizing the wildflowers of our country by having these fairly simple prescription mixes which are sown on a large scale. So if the same combination of a dozen wildflowers is planted on every farm all across Britain, then that's actually not great for biodiversity, is it? We're losing the heterogeneity, the mixture, the local varieties of different plant species that would have naturally lived on those farms. So I don't know what the answer is. It's really difficult and expensive to have tailor-made seed mixes that are kind of regionally appropriate. I can't see that being viable. That would be the ideal. But we certainly, an alternative is to try to encourage natural regeneration from the seed bank, where there is one, but sometimes there just isn't much, and if you do that, you just end up with a bunch of docks and nettles. So it's a bit hit and miss. I don't think there's a simple solution, but we should certainly, I think, try to diversify these mixes as much as possible. Because I guess the reason you asked the question is, you mentioned non-natives as well. I don't really understand why sometimes these wildflower mixes contain cosmos and the like from all that, weird exotic plants. That seems like a really dumb move. Anyone else? Guy here.
Yeah, thank you for everything that you've done. Bit of philosophy, I think, if you don't mind. We've had the silent spring. We've had the silent earth. Would you care to speculate on the next great silence?
Well, the next great silence. I'm not even sure what the question means really, but obviously the title Silent Earth is alluding to, it's kind of a tribute, I guess, to Silent Spring. We do, it seems to me, we're at a kind of crossroads, aren't we? That we could still salvage much of the life of our planet if we really pulled our fingers out at this point. But we don't seem to be doing so. We don't seem to be taking it seriously. Government actions, we just heard yesterday that the actions on climate change are woefully inadequate, and we're not going to, it seems, reach at the government's own legally binding targets. The reason I wrote Silent Earth was to try and kick people up the arse, basically, and say, look, it's not quite too late, but it will be. It really will be. Actually, let me take that back. It will never be completely too late. It's not a win-lose, yes-no, black and white scenario. It's just going to get worse. If the slower we act, the worse climate change becomes, the worse biodiversity collapse becomes, the harder life will be for future generations. So anything we do is good. Any step we take now is better than nothing. But really, if we want our children to have a good life, then we need to pull out all the stops right now and do everything, see this as the top priority for the human race, it seems to me, is basically working out how do we feed everyone without destroying the planet. a real that I think is the challenge we face. And I just hope we can galvanise. I mean, it's encouraging here, isn't it? There's so many people doing really amazing, interesting things, but it needs accelerating. And I think the only way that's going to happen is if government policy really supports farmers in shifting to adopt these regenerative practices and funds more research to work out exactly which ones work best and so on. So it's that government support for this kind of grassroots movement that seems to be lacking at the present. Didn't really answer your question, sorry, but... We're out of time. Sorry. If anyone's got any urgent questions, I'm going to go to the book tent straight up there and happy to chat further. Thank you.